Before we start, a quick note that this episode was recorded in person before the appearance of COVID-19. Any references to group activities were well before any of us were concerned about social distancing. Please stay safe and enjoy the show.
That just kind of drove me, this idea of people, that there were these groups of people who got to make decisions for everybody else. But as a citizen, you could be at the table if you chose to be. And then why wouldn't you be?
Right.
So that idea that people would sit out, like not exercise their right to vote, not go to a government meeting, not read a newspaper, like those things, as I learned more about how life worked, it drove me crazy that other people didn't do that.
From Fiore Communications, it's How I Got Here, a show of inspiring stories from Tallahassee area leaders, business owners, and neighbors, all the challenges, opportunities, inspirations, the twists and turns of life that led them to where they are today. Everyone has a story worth telling, and I am really grateful that we get to bring a few of them to you. I truly have been changed by my conversations with these amazing people, and I'm confident you will be too. This is Dave Fiore. In this episode, I speak with Rachel Pienta, the 4-H Youth Development Program Director at the University of Florida's Extension Office in Wakulla County. A native of upstate New York, Rachel finished high school in rural Central Florida, where she says she felt a little bit like Kevin Bacon in Footloose. She earned a Ph.D. from Florida State University, has led organizations, run local political machines, and is a longtime educator. Rachel, along with her husband David, whom she met at a speed dating event, gives back to the community in many ways, including hosting exchange students from around the world. We started by talking about her early years. So you were born and grew up in Bloomingburg, New York?
So I was born in Middletown, which is sort of the larger city center for that area.
Okay.
And but Bloomingburg, we moved there. My parents bought a house in Bloomingburg, which is sort of up the mountain a little bit. This is the foothills of the Catskills.
Okay.
So Middletown is very much a bedroom community for New York City.
So Catskills is like Dirty Dancing,
yes.
Right?
Oh, totally.
Okay.
Totally Dirty Dancing, for sure. So we bought a house in Bloomingburg when I was about 3. And we would live there until I was 16. And the Dirty Dancing thing is really funny because this is not in my resume anywhere. But so my dad, I would describe him as a serial entrepreneur because he's passed away, but he owned a lot of businesses. But a primary thing throughout his life was working in the field of magic. And
really?
He created magical illusions and gave lectures on how to do close-up magic, which he was an expert at. So he wrote books and produced videos and gave lectures. But at the time, the Borscht Belt Catskill hotels were still pretty prevalent in the 70s and 80s. Many of them have since closed, burned down, become other things.
Right.
But I spent some of my formative years following my dad around those Dirty Dancing style hotels as he went to magic conventions or did lectures or supported other kind of famous people with their things they wanted to do for their act. Like if Dom DeLuise wanted to pull a lit match out of his smoking jacket, my dad was the guy who helped make that happen. Yeah.
Wow.
So I grew up with I can remember going out, staying at a particular hotel with my dad and going out in the morning and the guys with the tigers, Siegfried and Roy.
Yeah.
They walked their tiger around the pool in the very early morning. Yeah.
Sure, because that's when tigers like to go on a walk.
To hunt prey, yes. But, so that was kind of a different type of growing up because I got to interact with some famous people growing up, like David Copperfield and Captain Kangaroo of all people, and just there's a list.
Captain Kangaroo.
Mr.
Green Jeans, the whole deal.
Yes, yeah. I didn't actually recognize him out of his persona when I first met him. And
did he have the sideburns though?
He did, but just out of context, I was it took me a minute to place him, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's Captain Kangaroo. But yeah, so I got to have some fun experiences like that growing up because of my dad's work in magic.
So your dad was kind of a magician to the magicians.
Exactly. Actually, that was how he was known. He was the magician's magician.
Wow.
And if you Googled him, you'd see people talking about that online.
That's amazing.
It was a pretty cool way to grow up. It
Yeah.
definitely gave me some different experiences. Most kids can't claim to be cut in half or suspended on 16 swords or made to disappear. So I've levitated. So it's
So was he experimenting on you when he was developing some of the tricks?
He would experiment.
Illusions?
He would experiment his illusions. Yes, very good. You must know some magicians. He would experiment on me. Also, sometimes I gave him ideas because I would think he could do anything. So at one point, I handed him a quarter, and there are different types of tricks where you make things pass through surfaces,
Right.
balloons especially. So I wanted him to put a quarter into a balloon. I'm like, Dad, you could do that. Put a quarter into the balloon. And he's like, actually, I haven't done that before, but let me think about that. And that became a trick actually that was distributed by Disney World for many years called the coin balloonacy.
And he developed that because of your idea.
Because of my idea, because I said, Daddy, do this. Make the quarter go through the balloon. So it became an illusion.
Wow. I did not expect that.
Doesn't show up on a resume.
No, but it should. That's awesome. Tell me about the rest of your family. Did you have siblings, or what was family like outside of the world of magic and illusion?
So I had one sister who also actually has passed away. But so it was me and a younger sister, 5 years younger. And when we lived in New York, we kind of lived in this old rambling farmhouse that we had chickens and always dogs and cats and a garden out back because my mom was a farmer's daughter. That was her background. And so she likes animals and growing things to this day. So we lived in New York, and she was a nurse. And my dad had businesses with his mother, different retail operations, and then the magic. And then my grandparents decided to sell their horse farm and move to Florida to retire. And my mother said, I'm kind of tired of snow. I'd like to follow them. So they actually went in on property together in Florida and bought 40 acres in Bushnell, down in Sumter County, just below Ocala. They wanted to be in horse country but not pay Ocala prices at the time.
Right.
So between my sophomore and junior year, we moved to Florida. And that was an interesting transition. Florida in the 80s, I thought it was like being Kevin Bacon in Footloose. So it was that between that and the Twilight Zone because it was so culturally different at the time.
And especially that part of Florida, that's inland, rural Florida.
Super, super rural. So there were things that were culture shock. I mean, having grown up as, quintessential Yankee with a New York accent. I mean, my father was from Brooklyn, and when I was 16, I talked like a city person. And to move to Florida with all these Southern accents in a rural area, I was like very exotic. And there were things a lot that became clear to me about American history because Florida was under court-ordered desegregation dating to the 70s. So in the 80s, that was really fresh in people's minds.
Right.
And so I was not aware of race issues, for instance, or the idea that the Civil War was taught in a different way between the North and the South. I'd never heard the phrase War of Northern Aggression until I was 16 years old. So
like
it was
a pride of Southern history.
Pride of Southern history and this whole different perspective on American history. So that was a big sort of consciousness flip for me and my first experience with culture shock. I made some great friends, and I actually, I'm coming up on my 30-year reunion, but the year of my 20-year reunion, I went to my Florida reunion, actually helped plan my Florida reunion, and then I went to New York to the kids I had known since kindergarten and was part of that reunion also. Okay. So I have 2 graduating classes.
With the Florida in Bushnell, did it take a while, or did you adapt pretty quickly, do you think?
So I adapted pretty quickly. I'd had some good advice from one of my guidance counselors in New York who said, it's a sports-oriented high school, get on a sport and get in some extracurricular activities, and that will be open to everything.
Right.
So when I went and got on the volleyball team, became part of the yearbook staff, and then I I actually went anytime someone asked me to go to their church group, I went, even though I'm a Jewish kid. I went to lots of Baptist churches and made lots of friends that way. My sister probably had a harder time. She was starting 6th grade, and middle school's tough for anybody.
That's rough. Yeah.
So the move was definitely a struggle for her. And years later, my mother said, if I had known how hard it would be for her, I would have waited till you were both out of high school. Which for me probably would have been super, super different. I don't know that I ever would have ended up in Florida. But I ended up making friends and deciding to go to University of Florida. And that was, so that the move was formative in a positive way for me, maybe not so much for Sarah.
Right. I assume you did well in high school. You made good grades. All that part of it was good.
I did. I always struggled with math and science, but I made up for it in the other classes. I was very good at English and history and writing and things like that. But math and science were always the hard sciences. Like I could do well in psychology, but like not chemistry. And then math was always a struggle.
Right.
But I kind of had to balance it out.
All right. So you're finishing up high school in Bushnell and you're doing well. And why did you choose the University of Florida? What led you to Gainesville?
So I didn't really want to go that far from my family. I just had this big move, and it was like, oh, I could move back to New York, and I have extended family there, but my nuclear family is here, and I was always super close to them. I didn't want to go really far, so I said, let me concentrate on Florida schools. And at that point, I was like, oh, and I have in-state tuition down here. This makes sense. So I toured schools and was looking at University of Miami. At that time, I was really into communications, actually, and thought that I wanted to do something with writing and journalism. And so I went to University of Miami, looked at them, looked at Florida State, USF, University of Florida, and it came down to UM and UF, and then I realized that my parents would probably have to take out a second mortgage for me to go to UM.
Right.
And
As a private school.
As a private school, I was like, yeah, I think UF makes sense. It's closer to home. It's a better financial deal. I think I'm going there. And my whole family fell in love with the campus and thought it was really beautiful. And at the time, Florida State was not beautiful. I had gone up there for Girls State, and the campus was not as beautifully developed as it is now. And so it was sort of 70s industrial looking with lots of like woods in the middle of campus. And the stadium wasn't what it is now.
No,
so
it was still the erector set.
It was still the erector set. So,
right.
So yeah, UF looked like a country club by comparison, and it seemed to make more sense.
Right. And you studied English and political science.
I did. I ended up not going the communications route. I was in college at the time that the Gulf War broke out, Desert Storm, and journalism was changing. And if I was going to college now, I think journalism might be more attractive. But at that time, it was 1990, 91, it looked like journalism was just reading someone else's news. That didn't really interest me as I saw things unfold. I started to think more about policy and being interested in that side of things. Did a internship with then State Senator Kirkpatrick. Went overseas and interned with a member of parliament.
Oh, what was that like?
Really interesting. The guy had been knighted by the Queen for his service. So he's in the House of Commons, but he was Sir Fergus Montgomery.
That sounds very important.
He thought so.
Yeah.
So it was interesting because I got to go into Parliament every day with a group of students and do some different things. And then
they're pretty rude to each other there, right?
It's
much different dynamic.
It's amazing to sit in the House of Commons and have them yell at each other. I was there during the Channel debates when they were going to do that. And they were not happy about giving the French easier access to Britain. They thought that was a bad thing, that the French were somehow going to take over their culture.
So did you immediately start pursuing your master's at Florida State, or did you do something in between?
Let me think about this. Oh, in between, I spent some time in Washington interning for then Congresswoman Karen Thurman. Mm-hmm. So I did that, and then also took a little break to work at a summer camp in the Poconos. And then I went up to Florida State to do the master's degree and got another policy internship with the House of Representatives.
Right. Why did you choose Florida State for your graduate studies?
Because the legislature was there, basically. And I was interested in policy. And I thought, let me go be where the state capitol is. And that's going to be the best opportunity for me to get immersed in policy and maybe actually get some hands-on experience.
Right. What elements of policy were you most interested in? What was driving that desire to learn more about that?
Growing up in the 80s, at the time, there was this like epidemic of teen suicides. And my middle school was hit pretty hard with it. It would be like you get a bathroom pass and go in the bathroom, and there would be some kid in the middle of overdosing in the bathroom. And this would just happen over and over again. And some of my friends and I were talking about it, and we're like, we don't have, we see on like ABC after school specials that there are like teen counseling programs and there are peer programs, and our school doesn't have anything like that. And one day I marched into the principal's office and said, enough is enough. I am tired of finding kids passed out in the bathroom. We need to do something. I want a peer counseling program. And my principal looked at me and said, let me see what I can do. So
I mean, that takes a lot of guts to go in there and do that.
Guts are just like no sense of like, anything except that I could be a bull in a china shop, right?
Right.
But I was pretty insistent. And the school district that principal went to the school district on my behalf. And actually they hired a peer counselor expert for the whole district to develop a program. And then they said they were going to pilot it in the high school. And at that time, I was still in the middle school because our 9th grade was still in the middle schools because the high school wasn't big enough and they were in the process of expanding it. And so I had pitched a fit because I was like, look, we're having this problem in the middle school. We need this here. We need to be part of it. And so they said, okay, fine. We'll let 8th graders and 9th graders get trained also.
And were kids coming forward to take advantage of this service?
Yes. Yeah. It was pretty mind-blowing, the stuff that some of the kids were going through and the things that came out. Like the adults in the room, I remember, were just like really blown away by what was happening. And that influenced me, just this idea of, okay, like sometimes policies don't take care of all the things and you can look at a way to fix them. So it was this really early formative experience to say that policy can improve lives, because I understood that it was a policy that allowed us to go forward to try to do this. So I started being really interested in policy and thinking education policy, because in my head, it all started with kids. Like if there was any problem in society, we should start with the kids and then go from there, because we were going to be, the next generation. So it would make sense that we were the foundation of everything. Right. And so that was sort of like my primary belief going forward, that I was trying to figure out, well, what does my career look like if I want to work in that space?
And you continued on to get your Ph.D.
I did.
Was that always part of the plan?
No. So when I was an undergrad, I thought I was going to somehow become the National Secretary of Education. And I had no idea how that worked, but that's
still possible, I guess.
It's still possible. Some certain things have to happen, but at UF, the counselor said, you want to work in education policy. There's a lot of different routes to take this. And they advised me at the time to go out and teach right away and get that under my belt. And I really wanted some more school. So I said, well, I'm going to go to FSU and get into their teaching program. And then also look, because there was the policy program at the legislature, and I was really interested in it. And the first time I applied, I didn't get in, but I was like, I'm going to try this again. So let me go up to FSU. I'll apply again. We'll see what happens. And the second time I applied, I got into the policy fellowship for the legislature. And then while I was doing it, I started to think about, okay, well, what comes next with policy? I saw lots of people talk about education who didn't necessarily know much about it, except that they, like me, had been students. So I did things like a reading recovery program at a middle school and just started to try to get more hands-on experience. I'd been a camp counselor, but I hadn't been a teacher per se. So I took as many of those opportunities as I could.
Right.
And then as I was getting done with my master's degree and getting done with my fellowship, I was like, okay, what's next? And so I started trying to decide. I was like, I'm going to go to school more, but either it's going to be a law degree or it's going to be a doctorate. And then my folks in the legislature that I worked with said, we got tons of lawyers up here. Go get your doctorate. So that really influenced me.
Yeah. After you got your doctorate degree, where did you go after that?
Well, I worked during my doctorate degree, actually.
Okay.
So I ran an after-school program for a while during my doctoral degree for elementary school. It was a Florida State program. And so I was their after-school program director. And then I got the chance to teach at the university as part of my graduate program. So I started teaching classes. I taught at TCC, Florida A&M, FSU, Walden University, and Kaiser College.
Wow.
At different times. So some traditional, I did some of the early online education before it was really a big thing. So I was sort of a pioneer with that about 20 years ago. So
did you enjoy that?
I did.
I mean, it's a different experience.
It's a very different experience. And actually is what I ended up doing with Valdosta State for 5 years when they started a graduate online program.
What do you take from that time of teaching in all those different places and in different ways?
Well, gosh. I did a lot of traditional teaching between TCC and FSU and FAMU, and I still know a lot of those students today, and seeing where they are in their career is really neat. Sometimes getting to help them with things in their professional life, because some of them still call on me, is really awesome. It's nice to be able to still have that impact. I also have really fond memories of the 4 years I taught at a high school. And I coached soccer and I taught AP literature.
So when does that fit in? When is that? You were at Wakulla High?
So I got a job at Wakulla High School right after I finished the doctoral program. And so that was 05 to 09.
What was it like teaching at Wakulla High?
Interesting. Culture shock at first also. A
different culture than Bushnell culture?
Somewhat similar to Bushnell in many ways, but different than what I had been living in Tallahassee.
Right.
And now Wakulla over the last 15 years has become a little more like Tallahassee, but in 05, it still held a lot of its very rural character. Wasn't that long after the net ban had really decimated the fishing culture in Wakulla. Right. So there were a lot of families in transition. So there were different things that were happening in that county that were changing their way of life, and the children were experiencing that.
Right. And coastal Wakulla County is even different than Crawfordville. There's a wide variety of situations there.
There is a wide variety of situations. So there were things that I didn't realize about families living on the coast who might be living in some more primitive living conditions at that point, who had been living pretty simple lives, on the water or farming, doing things that were a little bit removed from the more, modern Tallahassee experience. Right. Yeah. So getting to experiencing that and understanding that difference was a learning curve that first year. I then really came to appreciate those kids a lot and really loved working with them, loved coaching, loved seeing kids figure stuff out and decide what they wanted to do with their lives.
All right. So I saw on your resume that you worked as a methodologist and doctoral advisor at Walden College.
I did.
I have no idea what that means.
So, Walden University is part of Laureate Education. It's actually an international system of colleges and universities. It's worldwide. At the time where I was looking at going back into university teaching, I had looked at a bunch of different places. And so I had that K-12 teaching they told me to have, but they said, oh, well, we'd really like you to have doctoral advising now too. See, the game changes, Yeah. So I was like, oh, I don't have that. So Valdosta State was willing to hire me, but they weren't teaching me. They weren't hiring me to teach with doctoral students. The highest level were EDS, education specialist. So I said, I got to get some doctoral advising experience. And Walden said, well, we need people to advise people working on their EDDs, their education doctorates. And I was like, okay, let's do it.
So now we move into another phase, 2010, 2011, where according to your resume, it kind of blows up as far as activity and things you're involved in. Those include things like serving on the Wakulla Democratic Executive Committee in several roles, including county chair. And so I want to ask you about that. How did you get into politics, and what was your motivation, and what did you do with the Wakulla County Democratic Party?
Oh, gosh. So the political thing goes back to my childhood because I had relatives who served in different elected positions on town councils and at school boards and things like that back in New York. So I always had this interest in politics. And then as a college student, I had been involved in politics, working on campaigns and also in student government. So, and some with the Democratic Party in college, I volunteered like for their state conference and stuff. Right. But I had really taken a break for it for a while during my graduate studies. My parents always talked to me about politics growing up. When I was little, my first memory of a presidential election was being a very small child, and when Jimmy Carter was running. And my parents really liked Jimmy Carter. And they were like, he's a peanut farmer from Georgia, and he's going to be our president. And I just thought that was the greatest thing ever because, I mean, he's a peanut farmer. He sounded really cool because I was 5.
Anybody who makes peanuts.
Right, exactly. Cool. I like peanut butter. This is great. So, yes. Years later, I actually told President Carter that after he was president. I met him later on. And he thought that was pretty funny. He's like, great. We all like peanut butter.
So why do you think you always had an interest in politics? What drove that?
I was just fascinated by the idea of governance and policy. It was just really interesting, this idea of people being interactive with their government, that you could have a voice, that you could make things happen. And I just, as a young age, I started just reading all these different things about government and policy and thinking that was really interesting. My parents, my dad specifically, talked to me a lot about government. He was a young man, of course, during Watergate and those things that happened, and those were formative for him and his understanding of politics and policy. So we had a lot of deep dive conversations growing up about government and his philosophy of, well, you always have to question your government and you don't take for granted anything that they do. Just because someone's an authority doesn't mean they're right, and you should question them. Now, that said, I did apply that in terms of my interaction with him. And then I told him, you told me to question authority. And he said, I didn't mean me.
That's right. Parents are different.
I was like, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. But that just kind of drove me, this idea of people, that there were these groups of people who got to make decisions for everybody else. But as a citizen, you could be at the table if you chose to be. And then why wouldn't you be?
Right.
So that idea that people would sit out, like not exercise their right to vote, not go to a government meeting, not read a newspaper, like those things, as I learned more about how life worked, it drove me crazy that other people didn't do that. Like, what's wrong with you? Why not? Which is one of the reasons of getting into party politics was, well, can I convince other people to do this? Because they should be. Like, people fought really hard for us to have the right to vote and for us to have this representative form of government. And like, I used to tell my teaching colleagues, hey, our profession is one that is totally policy driven. And as citizens, you can impact the policies that basically govern your work life. Why wouldn't you be involved in politics?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's just, so for me, it was sort of this thing that like, this makes sense to me. Why doesn't anyone else get it? Like, how can I help them get it? So that really got me to getting more into politics.
And then you jumped back in.
I jumped back in. Yeah. When I lived in Leon County, I sort of visited politics. But Leon County is a very different beast of politics. And there are some strong personalities up here. And when I was in graduate school, I was mostly watching and lurking and occasionally like helping out if somebody called me with something. And then when I got to Wakulla, because it was smaller and the personalities were different, I said, let me get back in. And I didn't tell anybody I had been involved. I didn't tell anybody my political resume. And I started getting involved. And I actually got kind of outed right after the 2008 election. My the then party chair was going to a state party meeting, and was sitting around talking about people who were active in her local party that she was hoping to bring into leadership. And then she threw my name into the ring. And everyone who was
like,
state party
wait,
officers
what?
around the state, they were like, right, she's in your county, and she's like, do you know who she is and what
Take
she's
advantage
like?
of her.
Well, then, she came back from that state meeting and called me up and said, "You have been holding out on me," and I was like,
But that's smart, right? You don't want to come in there and say, look,
well, yeah, exactly.
I'm the one with all the experience. Let me start running the show. Nobody wants that.
No, exactly.
Right.
And so I wasn't going to do that. I was kind of like, I'm new here. I'm just going to, be a rank and file and do what she needs me to do.
But then you got outed, so it was over after that.
It was over
right?
at that point. At that point, it was kind of like, oh, I guess, I need to step up and do a little more.
But do you enjoy that? Were you ready to do that?
Yeah, I was ready to do that. I was ready. So when it came time for me to jump into the role of being the Democratic Party chair, I was ready to do it. So that was a lot of fun. I got to do some interesting things.
And if I read the timeline right, that's right at the time of President Obama's reelection.
Yes,
time, right?
I got super involved in President Obama's reelection.
Are you involved in party politics now?
So I have, I'm at a different phase. I am involved, but in a different way. So I decided when I left working at Valdosta State and I went to work for the American Cancer Society, I started to phase out of having a leadership role in party politics because I had many counties in the Panhandle that I was working in where I was known. And I wanted to have the American Cancer Society walk in the door, not the Democratic Party.
Right.
So I had to step back because that was, cancer should be purple, right? Cancer should, and I needed to be able to work across the aisle and have people who weren't Democrats have confidence in me. So I said, first I stepped down as chair, kept my state committee woman position, and then ultimately said, I'm not going to be state committee woman anymore. I'm at that phase again where if people call me, I do stuff. But at this point, I actually probably help as many Republicans as I do Democrats. And it's, I think as I've grown older and as if things have changed in national politics, it's become more about the people and the communities than straight party line ideology. Right. Which is not conducive to me, leading a local party because you have to be straight party line ideology. And I'm not going to say I'm totally post-party because I'm still a registered Democrat, but I actually at times have changed my registration to vote in a Republican primary. And bringing, to where I am now for the American Cancer Society, where I being based out of Tallahassee, but having 14 counties and basically half the Panhandle, my territory went from Madison all the way over to Bay and Washington County. And so it's a mixture of blue and red territory, right? So I needed to be able to go to, any county commission, any chamber, any rotary, as it were, and not have them say, oh, she's that Democratic operative. They needed to say, she's the lady with the American Cancer Society. So I really worked hard to kind of, move myself out of one space into another. And then have used that now in my role with UF-IFAS because I have developed across the party line relationships. And so, there are people who know, she goes deep way back into Democratic politics, but then they also say, but it's funny because they'll be like, she's not like them, whatever that means. I don't know. I don't delve into it. I guess that's a compliment, right? It could be a compliment or not. But that said, I am welcome in more rooms than I might have been at one point. So let's just say that.
This episode is sponsored by Locally Loved Tallahassee, formerly Socially Loved. I'm excited to have a partner that has the same general goals of sharing great local stories and can benefit from reaching our audience. Their focus is to love where you live by sharing some smart, safe ways to love local. Even if it takes a few extra steps right now, supporting our neighbors is always the right choice. I encourage you to be part of their new Facebook group, Locally Loved Tallahassee, focused on celebrating local people and places. Join the thousands, including me, who are already on board and sharing stories about what makes Tallahassee so special. In 2014 is when you started with the American Cancer Society.
Yes.
And you were there for 4 years or so?
It's about 3 years.
3 years? Okay. And I saw that you raised more than $4 million for cancer research in that
Yes.
time. That must be pretty fulfilling for you. And sounds like a great accomplishment.
It is. And it's working with the American Cancer Society. I had been a volunteer with the American Cancer Society for years prior. Have lost way too many family members and friends to cancer, including my sister to liver cancer. And so working at the American Cancer Society was just deeply, deeply personal because I my sister died when she was 31 and my nephew was 4.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a big, of anybody I've lost to cancer, and I've lost a few, that one is the one that's the sucker punch for me.
Yeah.
And so to actually work in that space for every day for 3 years, deeply emotional, at times really hard for me, but also really fulfilling.
So what was your job? What did you do?
So I did something called senior market manager, which is equivalent to executive director in another nonprofit. So my job was to sort of keep all the balls up in the air, be the person who interacted with government, with CEOs, with the press. I negotiated media contracts, tried to be a rainmaker for my field staff who were doing events. So basically saying they'd be out in the community working and they'd say, well, I can't get into this business or I can't get this government official to talk to me. Then I would be the one who could open the door for them and make things work better so they could throw a successful fundraising event. And then I also did some work with our governmental affairs staff as being the Tallahassee-based manager. Then I could go into the legislature with them on their lobby days and have those relationships and help them get the volunteers into the right offices to have conversations that we needed to have about research funding.
Right. I can imagine, given your history with the disease, that must have been very fulfilling. And I mean, you're doing good work no matter what your history is, but understanding how personal it is, that must have been, you feel good about it because it's hard, but you were making a difference and that had to make you feel good.
It did make me feel good. I actually got offered the job on the anniversary of my sister's death. So that was like this sort of lightning bolt, like, okay, is God, the universe, whatever you think, is talking directly to me right now? So that kind of, that sort of set the tone probably for my whole experience there, that it was...
you were supposed to be there.
I was supposed to be there, and it was deeply personal. And we've made leaps and bounds in fighting cancer. The recent numbers on that are showing that we are winning the fight, which means that we're catching cancer earlier, and that when we catch it, we're able to basically treat it more effectively. So not only do we cure cancer, but we also make it possible to live very healthy, fulfilling lives with cancer for far longer than we ever could. So knowing that I was part of that and seeing those things is super, super fulfilling and meaningful. That said, now that I have moved on from that, I also realized that not crying every week at work is a bonus. So I don't know that I could have. I have friends who've worked for that organization for many, many years, and I think that they must control their emotions better than me, because I could be a sobby mess at times.
I can imagine. Yeah.
So now I get to work with kids and animals, and I don't cry every week. It's really nice.
Well, I want to bounce back at some point too. I'm just going to go there first. Then we'll get into the IFAS part.
Okay.
And I'm not sure where this fits in, but I don't want to skip over your work with the Oasis Center, with the anti-bullying task force, and some of the things that you've volunteered with over the years. When did that happen, and how did you get involved? And tell me about your desire to work on some of those.
Okay. So Oasis. Yeah. So in graduate school, I volunteered with Refuge House. I went through their volunteer training, and when I did it, I said, I want to do the hardest volunteer job they have, the one that seems to me to be the hardest. And at the time, what struck me as the hardest was being one of the volunteers who carried, at the time, a beeper, right? That tells you how long ago that was, carried a beeper to respond to rape calls at the hospital. So you would go in and be a volunteer victim advocate with someone who had been raped. And you would be there through their exam and also through evidence gathering by law enforcement. So I had done that for about, 4 years as a volunteer with Refuge House, and then had gotten a little bit involved also with their fundraising and community outreach. And so got to know all the staff, including at that time the executive director, Kelly Oddie. And when she decided to move on from Refuge House, there was a big dinner for her. And at that time, she announced her idea of having a women's center in Tallahassee. She had lived in other places that had one, but Tallahassee did not. And that was sort of her dream, was that Tallahassee could have a center for women and girls. And at that point, actually, we all pulled out our checkbooks and wrote her initial checks that day at the lunch. And then it took a few more years, but she made Oasis happen. So when it happened, I said, sure, I will sign up to be a founding member and make a donation to be part of those original people to get it started. So that it was near and dear to my heart. And I got to volunteer closely with that for a while. I still support it, but not as closely as I did, just because there's a lot of things out there that I support.
Right. And you also worked on an anti-bullying task force? I
did. So I had been really concerned about the issue of bullying for a while. Before I was a teacher, seeing it in the media, but then as a teacher, seeing that bullying was really having an adverse effect on some of our kids, and that it was this strange dynamic and that it was being amplified by social media. And so there were some high profile national cases that came out around the turn of the last decade. And we had some things that happened in Tallahassee with it as well. So people had approached then State Representative Michelle Rowinkle-Vasalinda about getting a task force going. And I had known Michelle for years. We worked together at TCC, and then I supported her when she ran for office that first time. And so when she convened a task force, I said, I'm going to go and volunteer, and jumped in and did some programming with her, and then had some different ideas about how to bring that out in the community. And Michelle really liked that direction and said, let's do these things.
All right. So final job jump to where you are today.
Yeah.
2017, you started at the University of Florida IFAS Extension Office in Wakulla County.
I did.
So first, some basic stuff. What does IFAS stand for?
Institute for Food and Agricultural Science.
Okay. And they're all over the state, right? University of Florida
has an office in every county in Florida. Interestingly enough, it really got started because policymakers at the time said that innovations in agriculture should really start with youth. And the idea is if you teach the latest and greatest about growing food and how to work with livestock to children, then they would bring that out into their communities.
Seems logical.
Seems logical. And I don't know if you're noticing a pattern at all, but that really aligns with what I believe about education.
Sure.
Yeah. It's
get them while they're young.
Get them while they're young. Exactly. They make them be lifelong learners and innovators, and who knows what can happen.
And so your specific role there is the 4-H Youth Development Program Director.
Yes,
right, so what does that mean?
So I get to run the 4-H youth programs. And that means I get to recruit and train and supervise volunteers that help me run those programs. So there are some different ways that we deliver 4-H youth programming. We do that in big programs that are multi-county, regional, statewide, and those tend to be very much faculty-driven. And then we do community clubs, which are run by members of the community who are trained by faculty, meaning the 4-H staff, and that we give them curriculum, we give them resources, we help support them in running a community club that aligns with some area of interest they have. Now, 4-H in the United States, over 6 million children participate in these activities. And it's over 200,000 in the state of Florida.
Wow.
And it is the largest. It's the largest youth-serving organization, and it is a nonprofit. Lives at land-grant institutions across the country, so it's different universities in every state.
So do you know what the 4 H's stand for?
Head, heart, hands, and health.
So that's pretty representative of the scope of the services and programs. They hit one of those areas.
Which means it's pretty broad. I tell people almost anything you could imagine or be interested in, someone in 4-H is probably working in that area somewhere.
Right.
It's really all encompassing. The idea is that we use these different activities to develop youth, to help youth realize their full potential.
So if somebody has an interest in something and they don't really know where or how to pursue that, 4-H often provides that opportunity.
They can. One of my colleagues says to me that he works primarily with kids who work with cows. And he says, well, the kids think that they're trying to get blue ribbon heifers. He said, but I'm really developing blue ribbon kids. And that's really the whole idea behind 4-H is that whatever they're interested, whether it's archery or cooking or computer coding, it could be anything like that. Could be government. We do a government civics program. But the subject area is really just a means to have kids develop their interest and develop their skills.
Right. And of course, one of the best known programs is the 4-H Tropicana Speech Contest.
Yes.
So do you have a direct role in that program?
I do. I put on the county-wide Tropicana Speech Contest for Wakulla County and actually our teachers. So it's a collaborative effort. The schools, so it's 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And the schools, I send them out materials every year. I say, okay, are you guys doing it this year? And the teachers say, okay, well, we're going to run it during this time. And they come up with school winners. And the school winners then participate at the county level, which I actually put on the whole thing for the county. And then they go to a district competition. And the district competition is the terminal part of the competition.
I just want to stop here before I go on, because before I hit this other stuff.
Okay.
How did you find the time? How did you manage your life and find the time to do all these things seemingly all at the same time? It seems like a lot.
Yeah. It's funny. I've been asked about that a few times in my life. Sometimes generally, sometimes at a job interview. Because
like, are you serious with all this stuff? You know?
Well, right. They're like, why do you run around and do all this? And that can be a really hard question to answer. You know, as a single woman, your time is very different, right? So it doesn't matter if you decide that you're only going to sleep 3 hours a night or something. And it doesn't matter if you're getting dinner on the table, right?
Well, it matters eventually.
Eventually, yeah. I mean, it catches up with you, sure. Yeah.
But you're not answerable to anybody for your time. You're just filling up your day how you want to.
Right. You're just doing, right, exactly. So I didn't meet my now husband until I was 31. So my 20s, it was wide open. Let me go do anything I want at any time. And I did that. And then once I met my husband and got married, I started to have more structure to my time. And that did change my approach somewhat. That said, I ended up marrying someone who also takes on a lot of things, who is similar in their perspective to life. And
let's talk about David for a minute.
Yeah, let's talk about David.
So tell me about your husband. How did you meet?
We met at a speed dating event at the old Buckhead Brewery. So, yeah. Do you know
who put that on?
Some company that professionally puts on speed dating.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it was a company that was operating at the time, and they traveled, I think, around to different cities to do this. And it was advertised like on the radio and in the newspaper. And at that time, I was single. I was coming out of a 4-year serious relationship. I'd lived with someone, had considered getting married, didn't work out, and was back on the market, as it were, and looking around and decided, that's different. I'd seen it on TV, like in movies and stuff.
Sure.
So let me go try that. And he was in a similar situation. He'd been in a long distance relationship, and that hadn't worked out. And so now he was on the market as well. So he had gone. And so we met that night. And the way they ran it was the woman sat at the chair, and when the bell rang after a certain amount of minutes, the men moved around the room.
Right.
Now, the funny thing for me is that at that point I had, I'm 31. I'd lived in Tallahassee since I was 22, 23. And I knew people, and I knew some of the men in the room. Like, really? This just cuts down my pool. This is terrible. Right. And some of them I actually didn't even know from Tallahassee. They had moved here from Gainesville. These were people like from my past.
That's weird.
I was like, wait, what are the odds of this? Why do I have this luck? This is crazy. So that added.
Did any of them end up in front of you?
Yes.
To talk to them?
Yeah, because they all come to you. They all
do. Okay.
So that was just crazy. But David came in front of me and we had the best conversation. And we talked about roller coasters, liking amusement parks and roller coasters, and going to rock concerts and horseback riding. And we just laughed and had a good time. So how does it work if you like each other? You get to you go on at that point, you went on a website after the night and you marked who you liked. So you could say like an absolute yes, a maybe, or an absolute no. And I said yes for him, and we matched up. So that was a Thursday night. On a Saturday morning, we got our matches and had to contact them. And I said, I'm going to contact him. I'm going to go ahead and make the first move. And so we had our first phone conversation that Saturday night, and we decided to meet for a date Sunday. Had our first date at Cabo's.
Nice choice.
It was a great choice.
Yeah.
Love that place. And yeah, we basically have been together ever since.
So that was it. No doubt from the beginning.
There was no doubt. Yeah. We decided by November that year that we were looking at marriage, and he proposed, we met late June 2003, like a week before 4th of July. And he proposed Valentine's Day 2004, and we were married August of 2004.
Wow.
So
I know this from a Facebook memory post that popped up online where David proposed to you on Valentine's Day.
Yes. At Disney World, at the Contemporary Grill, which is the top of the Contemporary Hotel, where the monorail runs through that futuristic hotel.
Right, yeah.
So the restaurant there is got all like glass surrounding windows, so you can see the castle and the fireworks. So he proposed around the time the fireworks were going off, and this waiter came out with a silver domed platter and opens it up, and there's a crystal slipper with a little a wedding ring, and on the plate it said, "Will you marry me?" in chocolate. And
props to David for that.
Yeah, it was definitely very.
That's the full Disney treatment.
It was the full Disney treatment, and super romantic. I kind of tease him. I was like, that may have been the most romantic thing, you've managed to pull off.
Well, when you start there.
I know. I was like, you kind of set the bar high for yourself. Yeah. He's like,
it's only downhill from
Yeah. So I can't, I've not expected him to pull off anything that amazing.
No, that's pretty good.
Although he did. Yeah, it is pretty good. Although he did actually give me a surprise party the night after the Vice President Biden dinner. He threw a surprise party for me for my 40th that did surprise me. So
that's good. So tell me about him. What is he like?
Dave is a lot like me in that he likes to be involved in the community and serving others. He's been a sports official the whole time I've known him. He is a certified ham radio operator. And when we first met, one of the things that we did together was actually volunteer with the Red Cross. So we did some disaster response together.
That's very cool.
So super fun, really interesting experiences. And then with his sports experience, he actually helped me coach soccer when I was a soccer coach. So that, really cool. And then he decided that he wanted to, comes from a military family and was in ROTC all through high school, started ROTC in college with the idea that he would follow into the services like his father. His father had been in the Air Force. And then decided in college that military life wasn't going to be for him. But that idea of service and putting on a uniform, I think, stayed with him. So later in life, later than most people do, he decided to go to law enforcement academy and got his credentials and now serves as a reserve deputy with Wakulla County. In fact, he just got promoted last year to being a sergeant for the reserve unit. I wish he had another hobby that didn't involve putting on a bulletproof vest, because there's that aspect to it. I didn't, never necessarily thought about being a law enforcement wife. but that's a real thing.
Oh, for sure.
So, yeah, there are times when I'm like, you know,
I mean, every time he walks out the door, right?
yeah, pretty much every time. So there are times, but every time he walks out the door, there's the idea that, like, you know, maybe he's not coming back or he could get hurt. And that is heart stopping for sure. So, but it's a big part of who he is. We just deeply, deeply love Wakulla County, and getting to serve it in a lot of different ways has become a big facet of how we spend our time and our lives.
Right. Well, speaking of service to Wakulla County, you've also served as president of the Chamber of Commerce.
I have.
Recently,
yes.
Came out, you know, your year was up not long ago.
Yeah, so now I'm immediate past president, which is still
the best title in the world.
Which is the best
right?
title in the world.
Right.
So I still get to sit in those executive meetings. But yeah, I got involved. I guess I got elected in 2011 to serve on the board of directors, and then started my service in 2012, and then became involved on committees and service and was asked to become part of the executive board. And I ended up serving in every role on the executive board. So I've been secretary, treasurer, vice president, et cetera, on up to becoming president.
So that's serving in a little different way when you're working on behalf of the business community and talking about economic development and protecting natural resources and the balance of all that, right?
It is. The balance of all that is very different. But it's another facet of my passion for the county. So getting to work on behalf of the business community, also nonprofits. We have nonprofit members and government members. So it's really a way that the community kind of comes together. And then also getting to work in that role with economic development and our Economic Development Council.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit, I want to touch on some of the ways you've been recognized in the community.
Oh gosh, okay, sure.
Okay. And again, there have been a lot, so we can't hit them all, but just in some highlights. You've been a finalist or won many local and prestigious awards, including the Red Awards from Tallahassee Woman Magazine, Distinguished Leadership Awards from Leadership Tallahassee, Volunteer of the Year from Tallahassee Democrat, 25 Women You Need to Know, and several awards related to work with a fraternity. So just want to get an idea of what those awards mean to you, what it means to be recognized for your involvement and activity. And I know it feels good, but you've done a lot, and it's got to be nice that people recognize your involvement and your commitment to making your community a better place.
It definitely is. It's absolutely nice to be recognized. It's an honor. It's like a humbling thing because a lot of times you're getting recognized by these things, but it's also in conjunction with other people. So you get to hear these other stories. And sometimes that's really humbling because you're like, I'm in the same space as these other people. They're really amazing. And there's a little bit of imposter syndrome there sometimes where you're like, oh, should I be here? Because that thing that those other people did, man, that just sounds way more amazing.
Of course, everybody feels that way. So
I guess I don't know. Yeah. I'm not those people. So I know how I feel.
Maybe they're like, I totally rock. I should win this.
Right. Exactly. That they could be doing that for all I know. I don't know. So there's that moment where you're like, oh wow, that story. Like I used to tell people before I was honored by Distinguished Leadership Awards that I loved going to that event just because I was always just blown away by the stories. I often like to sit back and be quiet and watch when I can and not always be that person. And so sometimes it's a weird juxtaposition. Like people don't believe me when I say that I'm an extroverted introvert, but I really like to be sitting at home reading the newspaper with my cat on my lap, having a cup of coffee in my PJs and fuzzy slippers. That's one of my favorite things to do in life. And yet I don't always have a lot of time to do that. And a lot of that's my own fault, obviously.
Right. I also don't want to leave without talking about your involvement with Rotary. I know that's important for you over the years and that you host exchange students, and you are hosting one now.
I am.
So tell me about Rotary and what that relationship with that group means to you.
So my involvement with Rotary actually goes back to long before I was an actual member. When I, along the way of various service activities, I first encountered Rotary when I was involved with the Tallahassee Parrot Head Club. And one of the members at that point was directing
That was not on your resume.
It's not on my resume. I know. I love Jimmy Buffett. Let me just say
That's
that. But
enough said.
Right. So, but that club is, they do service in addition to listening to Jimmy Buffett and drinking margaritas. They also do a lot of service. So one of the things we did was was to go serve a meal out at the camp, like Rotary does now, but the Tallahassee Parrothead Club did it for years as well. So that was my first involvement. And then as an education professor, I had the chance to send students to different placements for experiences. And I would bring students out there to also do a night of serving and playing with kids and doing activities. So I had that experience. And then
This is Rotary Youth Camp?
With Rotary Youth Camp, right. Yeah. So that was my experience with Rotary. And then when I became a high school teacher, the high school needed an advisor for the Interact Club, which is the Rotary High School Club, basically. Right. So I became the faculty advisor and got to go to Rotary meetings in that respect. The reason that we decided to get involved was Dave came to an event with me, and there was a Rotary student there at the time from Austria. And he met her and heard more about the program and said, we should do that. Dave and I haven't had kids of our own. We've been very involved in raising our nephews since my sister died, passed back in 2008. And so, no kids at home, but we like kids. We've always been involved with kids. We just didn't have any of our own. So we said we could host. And so we started doing that. And Dave loved it and decided he wanted to get more involved and ultimately became a Rotarian. Like I was the Rotarian. He had never been one. But the exchange program is really what got him to be a Rotarian.
Where have your students been from?
Japan, Brazil, Croatia, and now Taiwan. Her name is Xing Han, but while she's in the United States, she goes by the name of Jean. Yeah, we just love it.
All right, final two questions. Looking back, what is one person or thing that has changed or altered the trajectory of your life?
There's been a few pivotal things that have probably happened that sort of made an impression, especially like losing a few people.
Yeah.
Has been really formative. I lost a best friend my freshman year of college, my childhood best friend. And she was back in New York, but we were still very close, and actually left college for a few weeks in January of 91 to sit by her bedside. She had severe asthma and had an asthma-related heart attack. And it was horrible. She would have turned, we actually buried her on her 20th birthday. Her family asked me to be part of making the decision to end life support.
That's a lot to put on you.
Yeah. I mean, I was not even 19 yet. And I still get emotional sometimes. Oh, gosh. And she had been my best friend from elementary school through then. And that had a huge impact on me, just in terms of basically kind of thinking the perspective of all the things that she didn't get to do that we talked about. So in some ways when we talk about me doing lots of things, probably in my 20s, there was a thought in the back of my mind that Lisa wasn't going to get to do any of these things. So you
were doing it for both of them?
I was doing it for both of us. Wow. There were times when I had that thought. And so that was something that was really impactful and probably made me push, my limits because she wasn't going to get to do those things.
Wow.
So that would be the first one. Meeting my husband, has been a major trajectory changer. I don't know that I would have stayed in Tallahassee if it weren't for Dave. Might have taken opportunities to go somewhere else, but it made sense for us to make our lives here, first in Tallahassee and then in Wakulla. Yeah, and then losing my sister.
Right.
Hugely impactful because it made me choose working at Valdosta State to do online education because of the flexibility it gave me, because I was then able to volunteer every day in my nephew's school in Tallahassee, and ultimately became a PTA president because I was there every week. And then my work with the American Cancer Society. So yeah, losing her was hugely life-changing.
It's interesting that some of your life activities are to in a way to honor those that you've loved and cared about in your life.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I have to say, I don't think, if you asked me this again in 5 years, I would probably say that losing my father, because we lost him in 2013, and that I find myself going back to things that he said or did, or thinking about, like, what would he say about what I'm doing now? And yeah, that's, I think at some point that I'll be looking back and thinking that he did influence some things that I have done.
Right.
I can see that coming now, but I don't think I have full perspective on it yet.
The name of the podcast is How I Got Here. So we've talked about how you've reached this point in your life. What do you think your life will look like in 3 to 5 years from now?
Given how my professional life has been going, it does seem like I'm on a 3 to 5 year cycle of some major changes. Kind of hoping that maybe that levels out a bit. I like where I am in Wakulla County right now. I like what I'm doing. I think if I had the chance to become extension director over the department I work for, I would be interested in that if the opportunity was available. Otherwise, 4-H, there's a lot of work to do with 4-H, and I can picture myself working with 4-H until I retire. I think there'll be more opportunities with the county as Wakulla County grows also for me to continue my service. So I envision doing more of that. But it's hard to project for certain things. I want Dave and myself to stay healthy and keep hosting exchange students. And then anything else probably depends on what happens with politics, because depending on who's doing what can influence sometimes what I decide to do.
That was Rachel Pienta. Whether it's inspiring a new magic trick, encouraging a student, or providing assistance after a storm, Rachel has always been committed to making a difference, and our community is a better place for it. Thanks for listening to the show. You can subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, please leave us a review. It really does make a difference. Thanks to my amazing staff at Fiore Communications, who pick up the slack while I'm working on these podcasts, and to Troy Bloom for composing our theme music. You can hear more of Troy's creations on Facebook and Instagram at Troy Bloom Music. To connect with the podcast or suggest a future guest, follow us on social media or email us at podcast@fiorecommunications.com.